Okay, I do a lot of historic tax credit projects. I also do historic projects. This is not a tax credit project, but it is a historic project. It actually is the remnants of a historic tax credit project that had no use. So when I donated the building, I claimed the old boiler, because everyone that looked at the building that was going to do demolition said, you can't destroy this beautiful piece of art. It's a piece of industrial art. It has 260 tubes in it, and the craftsmanship is unbelievable. So it might not be a historic building, but this is a historic artifact. 28,000 pounds of steel in that thing. And we do light them up. We light them up at night. And I didn't put we also do holiday decorations. We put green lighting on them for Christmas too. When we did this, there was one little restriction from the Department of Transportation, because that's the freeway off-ramp. We weren't able to put lights into his eyes. So I fixed the DOT. We polished the insides of their 1930 Model A headlights. So we polished the inner bowls and we put reflective tape in there, so you can see his eyes actually glow a little bit just from the reflection. And when we finish, I'll show you my next little crazy project. So I'll save that for the ending. When Matt brought this up to me about talking about historic tax credits, my first thought was, there's too many experts in the room that know more about historic tax credits than I do, so I had to find a different subject. So when we had this thing a couple of years ago, it was for saving historic theaters, and I noticed there was a lot of people here at the event that were representing theaters. So I thought, well, instead of talking about the historic tax credit end of this, because we're talking about saving historic places, I wanted to show a couple of options that nonprofits can use to save historic tax credits in addition to the historic tax credits. This is a St. Peter and Paul in Milwaukee. I think there's been some proposals back and forth as far as making this into something different. But this is a situation where there's a church and a school, and a lot of times what happens is you can repurpose the school into housing or something similar to that, and refiguring another use for the church is a little bit difficult. Saving historic places is actually pretty critical. So I started to look to see what's available for churches, and I did a quick LoopNet search. There are a lot of churches for sale. That means there's a lot of stress and distress, organizations that no longer have homes, organizations that want homes. And the first thing for saving a building is not finding a developer to go in and figure out a way to renovate it. The first thing you have to have is you have to have a use, because without a use, you could renovate a building, and if there's not a use, it's useless, because you have to have the user first. So this is from a user's perspective. So what is the easiest way to reuse a church or something else? And if you hear from one of those organizations, the number one, donations. Okay, so if you're going out and you're trying to convince donors to give you money, you need a little extra hook to, how can I get the most out of a donation? And this is something that I've learned, so I can talk on this rather than the historic tax credit end of it. So this is a IRS form that is really the whole basis of the first half of this. And this is a non-cash charitable contribution. The beauty of this program is, one, we're currently in a very volatile real estate market. You can buy a really nice office building, You can build one right now for $250, maybe $300 a square foot. And it could be 5 years old, and I've seen 5-year-old buildings that have sold for $50 a square foot because they don't have a user. And that market right now is not changing that fast. So there's a big discrepancy in building values depending on if they have an occupancy or use versus no use. So this first one is one that I helped out a nonprofit. The nonprofit was trying to put a program together for this building. This is the Welford Sanders Lofts on the north side of Milwaukee. And the developers came to me and they said, we can't buy this building. We're trying to do low-income housing tax credits. We don't have enough money to buy it. Can you help us finance it? Can you, it was in the middle of its third foreclosure. They couldn't find a buyer, so the bank gave a note to a nonprofit. The nonprofit couldn't come up with the money to close on it. So they came to me and they said, can you help us? And I said, it didn't take long. I did a little searching and I looked up the assessed value of the building and I found out how much the bank needed in order to get out of this, or maybe in some cases the bank will take a haircut getting out of it. This is a perfect example of if you have a donor or if you have a building and you have a use for it, find a donor and say, we can leverage your donation. This is a perfect case of a leveraged donation. I made money on this donation and everyone came out ahead except for Uncle Sam. So this building, just to give you some numbers, it's a 200,000 square foot building. The bank needed 200,000 to get out of it. So it was $1 a square foot is what was owed on it, but it was assessed at $7 a square foot. So if you go back to this charitable donation, like artwork, stocks, anything, if you buy it, you hold it for a year and a day, and its value then becomes the market value, not your book value. So I bought it for $200,000 and I got a $1.4 million or a $700,000 tax deduction, which equates, by the time you put it into your taxes, it whittles it back down into the $200,000 range. But it left enough money that I could actually give a cash donation after. So it didn't even cost me any money to make this donation. So when you're looking for a building, if you can find a donor, you say, especially in this market, there's lots of opportunities like this. And sometimes they just fall in your lap. Other times you have to work on it more. This one is another example. I didn't do a donation on this, but what I did is I helped put together a purchase agreement because the nonprofit involved here, and the other thing with this, it has to be done with a nonprofit. And that's kind of, most cases, these sacred places, you're dealing with nonprofits. So in this case, it's a university, so it's a nonprofit. The university was interested in acquiring this, and we were able to come close to a deal. And again, the real estate market is volatile, and I told the seller, once we reached an agreement on a price, I said, if I can get an appraisal for $200,000 more, will you take $100,000 less in cash? And they didn't understand what I was talking about. So I said, well, I will give you this form and you will get a $200,000 tax deduction in addition to the sale price. And all of a sudden that made sense. So the university saved $100,000. So this is not historic tax credit, but this is a different government program here. Another project. An occupied building is worth right now twice the amount per square foot of a non-occupied building. So this building was worth a lot of money. I'll not put numbers on this one. It was worth twice of what I paid for it because there was a tenant in it. And the tenant, I knew that in the near future was going to be vacating. So I was able to get a tax deduction that was twice the value of what I paid for the building. The key is that I'm donating it to a nonprofit. So the first thing you have to have is a user that has a need or a use. And then when you find your donor, you can leverage and come up with some of these ways. Now, again, it's a volatile market. Appraisals are somewhat subjective, so you have to do a little bit of research and understand the market. But there's ways to do it where everyone comes out ahead. On this form, basically, you list for the IRS how much you paid for the building, and then you hire an appraiser, and the appraiser has to sign off on this, and the nonprofit that you're donating it to has to sign off. But how many IRS forms or things can you do that are only 2 pages long? So it's really a simple form. The other part beyond leverage donations is something that Jonathan mentioned before, and that is the disqualified leases. So like in the case of this building, you could potentially take this, if a nonprofit wanted to come in here and use that church for some way and also be able to renovate it, one way that you could do this would be you can't have the original owner, if it's a church that currently owns it, donate it and lease it back, because that would be a disqualified lease. But if you read through the guidelines for disqualified lease, one thing it can't be is a lease that occurs after a sale of the property, so you can't do a lease back. But if it's a new religious organization, I'm sure attorneys can come up with ways pretty easy to make that end work. But what you could potentially do is, if a church wanted to use that church, is a developer buys the whole thing and leases the space to the church for a below market rate. One of the disqualified lease terms is, it's 35%. So if a developer has a property and they want to put a nonprofit in there to use part of it, like this church, 35% of the property can be leased to a nonprofit, so as long on square footage. So if a developer came in and did this whole property and that church space is less than 35% of the square footage, you can lease it to the church, and it's not a disqualified lease. The other thing is, the nonprofit could sell this. If the church owned it, they could sell it to, that might get into problems with the resale or the sale leaseback. But a nonprofit also, like on the Nunbush Shoe Factory, this one back here, in this case, I donated it to the nonprofit. Then the nonprofit contributed that into a partnership where they became a minority partner. So the nonprofit can stay in as a partner in the project as long as they're a minority partner. So the for-profit developer was able to put together, they did low-income housing and historic tax credits on this, but the nonprofit was able to stay in also as a minority partner. And then I think in the end, after, I'm not good on low-income housing tax credit projects, but at the end of it, which can be 30 years, they can actually get more out than what their percentage that they go in at. So the nonprofit can do very well on this. They let the developer do the work. They stay in as a minority partner. With this, for this idea to work, you really need to have a combination, so that if you were going to reuse this church again for a religious organization, you really need to have enough square footage with it. With the school, it would be the typical. So you could make the school into housing, the church could be a religious location, and you can make that work because they're leasing less than 35% of the property. This is what the disqualifies. So if you can work around the disqualifications, it can't be used with tax-exempt bonds or tax-exempt financing. You can't put a fixed price in for reselling the property back to the nonprofit after the holding period. The lease can't exceed 20 years, and you can't. It can't be a sale leaseback. So if you can avoid those disqualifications, you can still make the deal work. If there's any questions on that, I can answer those now before I show my last frame here.
I have a question.
Sure.
Why aren't we all doing this?
What's that?
Why aren't we all doing
Yeah,
this?
good question.
Right? I mean, what the heck?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have a question. I mean, I was talking about our 4-acre parcel. We actually, somebody donated an older building that's been broken up into apartments. But I don't think that we took advantage of that donation.
And really, if you got your man.
Call me.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because what we've done now is we're renting it out as revenue, but should we have done something different?
Well, it does. You may very well still be able to do it.
Okay.
If you have,
If they filled out one of those forms? The 832.
well, okay, that donation's already been done.
I don't know. I would double check.
Okay.
But if that is done,
Well, I mean, timely. You have to hold it for a year
okay.
before you make the donation. So if you're bringing someone else in to the plan, they're going to have to hold it for a year before they donate it.
Got it. So we have another building on that property that we want to donate to a nonprofit. Okay.
Right, and
One day.
So, see,
a year and one day, yeah.
That one day.
Yeah, we're in a district, we're right off of the downtown, so we are in that gap where there are buildings that are going vacant and they're getting run down, and so we ended up with 2 of them on our property, one of which we could utilize, but there's another one that we really can't, and we just want to donate it and get it off of our taxes.
Yeah.
Or our utilities.
Right. And like I said at the beginning, not only do I do historic buildings, I do historic artifacts. I love artifacts. And I think I already mentioned to Mark, my little next, and so I actually have a picture of it here now. My picture before I was standing there, so this is a good way to waste $100,000, but it's just like the topping on a cake. You know, I did this historic building. I guess there probably would be some possibility I could come in for state credits only on a project like this, but it's not worth this is just a project that I think is a finishing touch. A lot of these water tower bases that you see around on buildings, most people don't even know what those are. And so the best thing to do is put the water towers back up there. So this is 130 feet up in the air to begin with. So it's not going to be a cheap project to put these tanks back up on top, but it's just the finishing touch back on top of the building. Yep.
Is there a way for municipalities to become minor partners like we were talking about before with sites that may not be selling?
I would think yes. They're not I would think yes. I would have to ask my tax attorney on that one, but I would think it would.
Okay.
Yep.
Who would be the holding company or the owner? You said the developer would buy the property, hold it for a year, and then, did I understand correctly, then it's donated to a nonprofit?
take the developer name out of the equation. This is really more for the nonprofit. In this case, the developer was the one that ended up with the property in the end, but the nonprofit stayed in as a partner. And I think that's really the way it has to work. I don't know, if the developer's in up front, then they have to help bring in the donor. And they can work with the nonprofit. But the developer's not the one that drives this. It really is either the nonprofit or the donor, not the developer. And that's why I figured for this, I figured everyone's thinking we're talking about developers here and how to use tax credits, so I figured I'd flip this around a little bit.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jen Davel, and I'm the Midwest Director for Heritage Consulting Group. And I'm thankful that Matt Jaros asked me to speak with you guys today. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to say, and Matt said I could do this, is just introduce my company, Heritage Consulting Group. We are a company that's been around for over 40 years. It started in Portland, Oregon, but that office is closed. Our original founder retired. Our home office now is in Philadelphia, but we have offices in Philadelphia and Kansas City, Missouri. Heritage just purchased Rosen Preservation Group, and they were in Kansas City, Missouri, if anybody knows Rosen. That's them in the lower right. They were all excited to join Heritage. But we are a company of 21 people, pretty goofy, pretty motley crew, but really smart, and we're really good at what we do. And we love working with developers and building owners across the country. We work in 38 states. Why only 38 states? Because there are states that don't have income taxes, so they don't need income tax credits. Anyway, so, but all that to say, we love what we do. We're pretty darn good at it, and so thank you. So if anybody has questions about historic tax credits, give me a shout. So a little background, historic tax credits. Dinah kind of started this. 1966, the Preservation Act of 1966. Why did that come about? Because we were demolishing our historic buildings in great quantities at that time, right? And the federal government was saying, can we do something to kind of slow this down a little bit? And so they created the State Historic Preservation Office, the National Register, all of these great things, right? But guess what? There was no carrot. There's no money. And we all know that's what it's gonna take. So 10 years later, about 1976, they were saying, why are these buildings still being demolished? Well, it's because we need the carrot. So here comes the introduction of the historic tax credit program at the federal level. Fast forward, so since then, we know, all of us here, I'm preaching to the choir, we know how awesome historic tax credits are, how important they are. We just heard about Soldier Home. But when I was thinking about this workshop, and we were talking about sacred places, our current state, it's hard. It's hard to implement the Secretary of Interior standards on these sacred places. And it's hard at the federal level. It's the National Park Service reviewers that are reviewing our projects. It's a hard job, right? And so I think in my presentations called What Works, we're going to talk about what we need to do to get these sacred places over that finish line using the historic tax credits. So that's what we're going to discuss here. I am a licensed architect. I got my master's degree at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Matt was my favorite professor. And I see a lot of other people that went to UW-M. I got my certificate in historic preservation. I knew that's what I wanted to do. And I worked at Miller Dunwoody in Minneapolis, and I worked at Strang, and I worked at Eli and Wilson in Milwaukee. But then there was this opening at the State Historic Preservation Office at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and they were looking for a reviewer, a tax credit reviewer. They were looking for an architect. And I said, well, I could do that. So I switched from private sector into public sector, and I reviewed these tax credit projects for 11 years, and I loved it. And all of this, there's a point to all of this. And then 3.5 years ago, Heritage said, hey, we want to branch out into the Midwest. Do you want to come join our group and introduce Heritage to the Midwest? And I said, sure, that sounds like fun too. Anyway, I have a lens into these historic tax credit projects from an architect's perspective, from the state reviewer perspective, and now I'm a consultant. So I have seen these projects from all these different angles. And so my perspective today on what works is from all of that experience and seeing it out at all these different angles. So here's my what works. Assemble your team. And not just anybody, but you want to get your varsity team together. You want to find those architects, engineers, the consultants, the accountants, the contractors. You want to find these men and women that love historic buildings, right? We know there's general contractors out there that can do, but there's only some that really love working on these historic buildings, right? So you want to assemble your team. Same thing with architects. There's a million architects, but there's some architects that really love historic buildings, like my friend Allison here. This is myself and Nick Kraus, my colleague from Philadelphia, and we are on the Barbara Coleman site in Rockford, Illinois. And this site is ginormous. It's a district with 12 buildings, and we spent 2 days out there photographing the whole darn thing inside and out. But I say this is in Rockford, Illinois, and part of, now that I work across the country, I meet SHPO reviewers in other states. And Darius is in Illinois, he's one of the reviewers, and he's awesome. So Darius meets us out on site quite often, and it's kind of like somebody else said, what John said, whenever Milwaukee Preservation Alliance calls him, he's like, oh, I know, whenever Darius gets a phone call from me, he's like, what are they doing out there? So I keep him updated. But keep in touch with SHPO. SHPO is your partner. If you're doing these historic tax credits, you want to really be in tune with them. And I can say that now that I'm a consultant.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What became of the Barbara Coleman building? I grew up in Rockford, so I remember. What became of that project?
It's a project right now. Jeffers Development purchased the whole site, and it's being redeveloped, building by building. Building 5, 4, and 9 are under construction right now into housing, but it's going to be a mix of housing, commercial. Yeah. Okay. Schedule. The next thing is, let's work on our schedule. Now in Wisconsin, we have a state statute that says you can't start any construction work until your project is reviewed and approved. That's not the case across the country. But here in Wisconsin, that's what we're going to do. So we're going to work backwards. Start from when you think you want to start construction and work backwards. And say, okay, we're going to give our architects time to do the drawings. We're going to give our consultants time to write the part 2, get the building listed, or at least the part 1 in. Think about all of that. And this ties in with these photos. There's nothing scarier from a consultant's perspective to have this awesome client call and explain his or her project, and you're all excited. And then I say, okay, when do you want to start construction? And they said, next month. No, that is scary. So that's almost as scary as these creepy basements that we see in our historic buildings, or these incredible stairways that we get to climb around. So that's my tie-in with my photos. So schedule. Design. When you're thinking about a historic tax credit project, and now, why wouldn't we? Why would we not do this? You want to start from day one designing with those Secretary of Interior standards in mind. Because those standards are complex, they're interpretable, like my former colleague Mark Beekle would say. The best thing about the standards is they're interpretable, and the worst thing about the standards is they're interpretable. So you want to, when you get your team and you got your architects and you get your consultant, start from day one on thinking about those standards. Otherwise, you're going to waste a lot of time and money designing a building that's not going to pass approval, right? And these standards are important not just for the sanctuary, if we're talking about a sacred place, but those standards have to be applied throughout the entire building. So whether it's the back staircase, the office, whatnot. Okay, let's talk about our sacred places. Can I go back? I did not tell you guys why. Does anybody know where this building is in Wisconsin? I bet not. What's that?
Some cemetery.
No, it's not. It is West Denmark Lutheran Church in Luck, Wisconsin. And this was where I spent the first part of my childhood. This was my dad's first congregation he was at. And when we talk about our favorite sacred place, this is mine. It's fantastic. Unfortunately, this building burned to the ground and they rebuilt it. So this building is no longer. But, okay. So when we talk about sacred places, we have to think about the standards. And with these places, most often, it's all about the volume. It's the volume of the space. So the photo on the left, we see the pews. Guess what? Those pews are considered furniture. You don't have to leave those pews there. The important thing is the volume. And so the photo on the right is a project that we recently completed. I don't know if it's in Massachusetts. But you can see the pews are gone. But guess what? That volume and the windows and the structure, the finishes, those are all still there. And so I love that we're brainstorming here to talk about what can these places be used for. You think about other large volumes, the Garver Feed Mill in Madison. That's not a sacred place, traditionally speaking, but that's a really big, large volume that they would not have been able to put floor plates in or do anything like that. What is that now? It's a Amy, what would we call that? It's like a
event space that has a couple of restaurants.
Event space. They have like different shows in there. They have, it could be a market. I mean, you could put open office space. You could put furniture in here and make it open office space. Restaurants, a gymnasium. I love that climbing gym photo that we saw. That was pretty cool. So let's be creative. And I did something similar to what Dinah said for Paul's presentation. I Googled and I said, churches, rehab churches, new uses. What do we see? I love it. There were a couple that were recording studios because of the acoustics. It's fantastic. Can you imagine recording your album in a former Lutheran church? I don't know. The one below that is the main building for a winery. And we know we have Bullsheim Winery. Do we need more wineries in Wisconsin? I don't know. Let's see, the lower middle, that's actually the pastor's son that opened a bar in the church. Lower left, that is Audible, the company Audible. That's their offices in a former church. And then on the top left, we see a cafe, which I think we would think of pretty typically. And I know that it does depend on the market. You know, we were talking about that. What's the program? What can go in there? It depends on the market. It depends on your community that you're in. But I think we need to think more broadly about what's possible. Because we love preservation not only for preserving our sacred spaces, but it's sustainable. It's the thing to do, right? Instead of throwing all of this into the landfill. I love this, and I wanted to show this to you guys because as consultants, we feel like we're pretty creative. We have to be creative every single day. And with the historic tax credits, you know, your building has to be determined eligible and listed on the National Register. And I think with sacred places, I think it's probably an easier ask. But this is one of my favorites. This is a project of mine, and it's in Elyria, Ohio. And it's a full block building, and you see in the upper right, that's what it looks like today. The lower left, that was the postcard. Originally designed and built as an Italianate commercial block, right? That's it. And you show up today, and the Italianate building is on the left. It's called the Dixon Building. And on the right, that's the Robinson Building. And that's what it looks like today since 1962. And so our clients called us and said, we want to do a historic tax credit project on this building. And this building is contributing to the historic district. So we're like, well, that's fantastic. What's that period of significance go till? Well, the period of significance for that district ended in like 1947 or something. I don't know. And we can see those changes were done in 62. So we talked with the SHPO office in Ohio, and they said, nope, sorry, that would be considered non-contributing. It's outside the period of significance. So then our owner said, well, but we want to do historic tax credits. So how do we get that building listed? And I'm not the researcher extraordinaire, but I work with people who are amazing. And they did the research, and guess what? The architect that did this not only new facade, but they redesigned the interior as well. And they won AIA awards for it in 1962 because it was such an example of the trends and of the future of updating and modernizing our historic buildings.
Wow.
So guess what? We got the Dixon Building listed for architecture. And now we're applying for historic tax credits. I was just out there a couple weeks ago, and it's under construction, so it's pretty exciting. So we want to be creative. And assembling your team, your architects, your consultants, your contractors, everybody has to be creative through this process to get us through. If you look at the program, Kendall and I were supposed to talk about QREs. And I was just telling my friends here, we were sitting in Jonathan Beck's talk, and I said, God bless that we have people like John Beck that wants to do things like these numbers, because it makes my head spin. But I know just enough, so I did want to tell you guys. And Paul mentioned this morning, that QREs, qualified rehabilitation expenditures. This is really important that you know when you're starting out your project. QREs, any work that you're doing to your building, inside or out. The roof, the siding, the windows, the doors, inside, any foundation, walls, MEP, painting, light fixture, all of that stuff. Sprinkler systems. Non-QREs are things that you can unplug and take with you when you sell your building 5 years after you receive your tax credits. So appliances, furniture, window coverings, none of those are eligible. And then site work, all of your landscaping, parking lots, exterior signage, all of that is not eligible for the tax credits. And it's funny because when I was at SHPO, I liked to know this so that I could help educate folks out there. And when I first started working at Heritage, Cindy Hamilton, our president, I was talking about some of this, and she said, Jen, Heritage, we do not provide financial recommendations. That's just not us. So I've gotten much better at saying, well, you're just the consultant. You'll have to talk with your accountant, and that's fair. But I do know just enough that I can get people moving in the right direction. So with that, thank you. Thanks for having me. Does anybody have any questions? Mark?
I saw that look. Not so much a question as a comment. When Jen says assemble your varsity team and get your consultants and everything together, if I could add one thing, listen to your consultants, because Jen and I can both tell horror stories where I'm talking to a consultant And they're telling me, I told them they can't do this. I said the Park Services are gonna approve it, and they're insisting I submit it anyway, because they wanna put that luxury vinyl plank down instead of refinishing the hardwood floor. And so they submit it in, and I say, it's not gonna happen. And then they say, well, send it to the Park Service, we want the response. So we send it to the Park Service denies it, you just wasted 90 days of time. And time is money to developers. So if a consultant tells you, that dog ain't gonna hunt, you gotta listen to them. Because that's not, don't just hire the right people, but actually enable them to do their job. And if they tell you something's not gonna work, just believe them. Because they've been around long enough to know the things that aren't gonna pass. Because we run into that a lot where they're not listening to them. I'm sure you have more stories to tell
absolutely.
about. They keep insisting on something and you keep shaking your head and then you're right.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. We do laugh. We said they did hire us, right? They did hire us. And sometimes they listen. But anyway, thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you, Jen, very much. Anyone else?
Talk about your work in sacred buildings, you know, mostly outside of Milwaukee, you know, and try and make it interesting for, you know, half an hour, 45 minutes. They'll love your work. And I'm thinking to myself, I haven't really done a whole lot of churches, and I do most of my work in the city of Milwaukee, but here we go. So here we go. Quorum Architects, going to do my selfless plug here for the firm that I started 31 years ago today. So happy birthday, Quorum Architects. Yeah, so the firm is 31 years old today. We're about 30 people working in a PAPS mansion, which is a national and state register building on the west side of Milwaukee. We have a holistic practice, architecture, interior design, landscape architecture, working together with our consultants, often historic preservation consultants outside the firm. A lot of the work that we do is community-based design. Matt alluded to kind of some of the work that we do on pre-designs and feasibility studies, working with a lot of nonprofits on how to reuse space, how to adaptively reuse space, and obviously new construction as well. So we really take a hands-on kind of working with our clients, not working on our clients, to really make their ideas come to life. And I think we define sacred place a little differently. When I think about sacred place, I think about those places that are important to everyone, that have an aura to them when you come into them, that just let you know that it's everybody's building, whether it really is everybody's building, but it's just our communal sense of history that transcends a particular religion or a place, but it's the buildings that are really icons of our history, or of our combined history, that we all agree need to be saved. I'm originally from Philadelphia, and this was sort of the first sacred place of the country. Jen talked a lot about how the historic preservation came to be. A lot of it came to be in an effort to save Independence Mall. When I was in high school, I really wanted to be a park ranger at Independence Mall, and that was kind of what I was gearing most of my undergraduate studies towards, because I just thought that would be the coolest thing in the world, because I so loved what Independence Mall meant to American democracy. And it was a place that every time I walked through it, I just felt the building being sacred. I think there's places here that have a similar feeling. When you walk into Milwaukee's City Hall, I sort of get the same feeling. And obviously the state capitol, which was able to be, largely preserved. Both those buildings have been deemed to be, significant to all of us, and warrant the dollars that are spent on extensive reuse. I don't think we should forget, I know everyone has talked about the different criteria that make a building sort of sacred or historic. Maybe I'm not seeing a difference between the two. Criteria A, event, criteria A, a famous person, or B, a famous person. Criterion C, which a lot of us get focused on, is design and construction, but really the other ones and criteria D, largely archaeological, do make, all are eligible reasons why a building or a place can be historic. Another place that speaks to me as a place that when I come to it, the social history of this particular place is one that transcends it into being sacred. The people that, when we did public outreach for one of the many studies on the domes that looked at how the building could be reused, the generations of people from so many different socioeconomic characteristics of that area of Milwaukee that came out and said how important the domes were to them. When a building can transcend into that level in people's lives, I think it's sacred. And I'm happy that there are ideas afoot to save those buildings. The Soldiers' Home, which was talked about over lunch, is another place that has always had that same feeling to me. We were actually, before the Soldiers' Home, the big project that came full circle, we did sort of the test case, which was known as Building 17, which is the surgeon's quarters, sort of on the north section of campus, right surrounded by the cemetery. My dad was a World War II vet and spoke very enthusiastically about his ties to that time in his life, more later in his life. And I was very proud to be associated with that project, the old surgeon's quarters, and turning that into a 12-unit SRO with the Housing Authority of the City of Milwaukee that sort of served as the test case for everything that came later. We were involved a little bit in the initial stages of the admin building as well. And I'm a proud donor in the second Wisconsin Women's Campaign in order to fund the redevelopment. I think others have alluded to the fact that sometimes it's even an industrial building that is really sacred to a community. This is a project that we did in Manitowoc. It's the Miro Artist Lofts. It's the old Miro building that made ships or boats, and then it made pans, and it was the largest employer in that community. And again, similar to the domes, the people that came out and said how important those buildings were and that they were so happy that this building had been saved at the opening was just, makes that building transcend in that community to something that's really sacred. Some interior views of the lofts. And this one's kind of an interesting definition of sacred. Originally, it was the historic Concordia campus. It was deeded to the Forest County Potawatomi, so it sort of became a separate nation. That separate nation, the Forest County Potawatomi, did sort of allow themselves to be reviewed by the City of Milwaukee, HPC, but they were also not reviewed by the state and federal review processes because they are subject to tribal preservation ordinances. And so all of these projects in the redevelopment of this campus were city reviewed and then TPI reviewed. This campus, similar to some of the early projects I talked about, is one that I didn't really think was going to have that group of people that came back. This project, when we talk about financing, really had an interesting sort of an assortment of reasons why it made absolutely no financial sense for the Forest County Potawatomi to put $65 million into the west side of Milwaukee to redevelop these buildings. The last project that we did, was the gym project, and that was the one that really made the least sense of any of them. And at the opening of that building, one of the old coaches came back and was practically in tears standing on the old Concordia basketball floor talking about how happy he was that these buildings were all still here. So again, I really feel like it transcends to a different level. We're proud to have won the AIA Wisconsin Design Award for special recognition for campus redevelopment, and the way that we blended the old and the new, the Germanic and the Native American. So here's the campus. It's a series of buildings, and the other goal of this project was to be uber sustainable. And so the interaction with the lead qualifications points on each one of the projects was paramount to the success as defined by the Forest County Potawatomi. When they design, they think that they designed for 7 generations. And that didn't start with the Concordia College. It was starting now again and tooling up these buildings for another 7 generations. So the oldest building that really is, meets everyone's definition of sacred would have been the old chapel, which was located in the first classroom building on the 2nd floor. And there were not only in the rafters above the chapel, lots of places where people had snuck up and written their initials all over the wood studs and beams, and their graduation year, which was kind of a heartwarming find when we were up there. But also just the memories of people who had come back and talked about the importance of the preservation of all of these spaces. You can see the middle space when it was a chapel. Initially, the Forest County Potawatomi kind of questioned whether or not to just take out the stained glass. And we said, well, that's the consultant piece. I think you were talking about listen to your consultants. Thank you, Mark. I said, well, they're not really religious icons, that are in these stained glass windows. They're non-denominational, they're just, stained glass and light. And so we convinced them that probably also for tribal preservation, but also for just their own, the continuation and the proper care of this building, that they wanted to put the stained glass windows back in. So here's the insides of the first building that we were predominantly involved in. Again, I'll refer back to earlier presentations. This is the construction details of the hyphen. The building, the library building and the classroom and chapel building were built approximately 8 feet apart, and none of the floor levels lined up. So there was a little bit of an accessibility issue coming between both. We used that opportunity to create a slice between the 2 buildings of new that allowed us to put in an elevator and a stair, and to connect all of these different levels in a way that was distinctively new and of its time. Again, the gym, the one that made the least financial sense of all, but it now serves as a original exercise space and doubles up with Woodland School as their gymnasium. Going backwards a little bit, my original sacred place, not my church growing up, but the Friends Meeting House in my backyard, a couple blocks from my house, was a building that I embraced when I was an undergraduate studying historic preservation and architectural history, and we were tasked an assignment to get a building listed on the National Register. So I worked with the Abington Friends Meeting to learn about the history of the building and the meeting house's history, and they did not end up wanting to list it, which I now know that happens quite often, but they have done everything to preserve the intent of a lot of the Secretary of Interior standards, which I'll come back to later. Professionally, after graduating in architectural history, I came back to Philadelphia, and I worked in a firm that had that actually Amy worked in too, as a former outgrowth, John Milner Associates, that did pure preservation with a group called Building Materials Conservation, architecture and adaptive reuse, architectural history, and then archaeology. So sort of back into those kind of criteria, which are for nomination. This was a project that the firm was working on before I got there and after I left, with dollars funded by the Pitcairns, who worshipped at this church, the Pitcairn family. So having a wealthy donor is a good thing. And that wants to spend the resources, that has that connection with place, that could support that level of restoration. We had stonemasons that came from Europe and were working on site for many years, and the level of the restoration was absolutely fabulous. And just working around that project, it was just a space that definitely defined sacred. Again, even though I'm not of that particular religion. I am of this religion. So this is my church. I serve on Emmanuel Presbyterian Church's building committee. And we became aware when a part of the tracery around the rose window started to crumble and fall into the street, that we had a problem. I think we kind of knew that before, but we have raised money to replace the rose window or restore the rose window, I shouldn't say replace, but it's out now for a year, while the wood tracery on the inside and outside is rebuilt in kind. The windows are out being restored. The stained glass windows are out being restored. And our option was to leave this, and the masonry around the window is also being restored. Our choice was to just leave the window as a board up, but we had so many community members saying, "What are you doing with that window? What are you doing with that window?" And so we then became very aware that that window is an icon to the community. It is not just Emmanuel's window. It is part of that Lower East Side community. And so we created an attractive board up, with as we use in our Main Street kind of question, and said Emmanuel Presbyterian Church is bringing this back, and so now there's a QR code that you can find out more about the window project and the fact that it's coming back. We are involved with the National Trust's Sacred Place initiative when they worked with a variety of downtown churches to talk about how they could retool for future generations. And one was Calvary, which is on 10th and Wisconsin, right across from the library in Milwaukee. And as an outgrowth of that initial study, 10, 15 years ago, the church worked with In Tandem Theater to put a theater in the lower level. And that kind of reduced their operating costs to an extent. In Tandem, unfortunately, did not keep going during the pandemic. They're now working with a group called Interchange that does comedy. And then a group called Vanguard is working now with the church as a sort of program partner to allow the church to be an operational church on Sunday and it to be a theater or a performance space or an event space other times. The church itself had taken out the pews many years ago. I'm hoping that they can put together enough to do the deferred maintenance that is still required. But meanwhile, they have a program partner that's allowing both entities to proceed. And I think that kind of creative problem solving was discussed earlier. This is a little project in Madison that I thought would be a perfect segue to our next presenter. It's a project called Durward's Glen that we did a study of about a year ago. A Catholic retreat center that's just an amazing series of little buildings that they're looking to say, how can we retool this building for future generations? We've done some studies of how it could be used as a retreat center, potentially also having outbuildings, and build on the beautiful space that is there and make it a marketable business entity, not only for the Druids Glen folks, but for other people going forward. I'm an enthusiastic supporter of historic preservation, whether or not a building is listed, or whether it's going to get a historic preservation tax credit, because really those Secretary of the Interior standards are best practices. They are what allow us to have our shared history maintained properly so that future generations can enjoy the same feeling of the sacred places that we have all adopted as important. So I always kind of push back when people don't want to list a building because they'd have to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. I feel like that is best practices. There's a whole series of fabulous, the preservation briefs, I guess it is on that one, that, give you free information on how to do things right. It's a wonderful organization that gives us great information. And then there's the Wisconsin state tax credits for historic homes. Another wonderful project. I live in a historic district. It's not the wealthiest historic district, and each piece of that historic fabric is important. I've talked to a couple of you. We had a contributing building in our district that had an attic fire on Thursday night before I came over here. I am going to talk to them about the residential tax credit program because it's important that that building be maintained correctly so that demo is not an option, right? And repairing it in a way that erodes the historic fabric of the whole neighborhood is not an option. So we have to make sure that places are preserved. The project that I'm showing here on the what is it? Your left, my left. I guess that would be the same. Is a little contributing building in the same district where an owner needs to replace his roof. I want him to do it right, and he wants to do it right. So we're going to be working with him, both with the local HPC program, as well as encouraging him to submit for Wisconsin residential tax credits. And then there's projects that would no longer exist if there wasn't Wisconsin match at the 20% for keeping income producing buildings. This is a series of buildings that, again, probably make no financial sense on 27th and Wells to restore those integral fabric of our community, to work with a new user, Near West Side Partners, to manage the building and have a variety of different operatives, and then 33 units of low-income housing, or market rate housing. And then the federal tax credit, another project that we were able to work on in conjunction with EUA, the Journal Commons, and really how important that building is to the fabric of our community and our industrial heritage kind of the press. With that, I'm going to turn it over to John Gronin to talk a little bit about his project, which I have one slide of, or you can go to your own slides, about his work in the historic preservation world in Iowa.
So I'm John Gronin from Dubuque, Iowa. My wife Mary and I founded a company close to 30 years ago that's rooted mainly in preservation, and it's kind of grown over time. We have about 60 employees in Dubuque. This grew very organically. We have a mix of construction managers, project managers, design. We're fully integrated. But really, the founding of our company was rooted in preservation, and I moved back to Dubuque from northern New York. My grandparents had willed their estate, if you will, or gentleman's farm to the city of Dubuque on the bluffs of the Mississippi to be used as a park. And it consisted of 5 homes and all of the historic outbuildings, and it was willed to the city for park purposes and to be used for education. And the city, we were in the worst economic crisis in our history. We had the highest unemployment in the country. So the property fell into disrepair. The city moved to demo the site and then mothball it for a future drive-through park. And I moved back to Dubuque at 21, and my brother moved back from Colorado to ensure that the city followed our grandmother's intentions and wishes, and that threw us headfirst into the preservation world as our board developed and our programming developed. And at about the same time, we were losing an alarming number of buildings in downtown Dubuque, and we decided that we needed to do something about it. And I read an article in the Wisconsin Journal, an article that featured Randy Alexander from the Alexander Company, and I said, "How are you doing this?" And so he spent a lot of time with me on the phone and talked to me about the historic tax credit program. And we were about an inch from losing our famous town clock building in Dubuque. And I went to the owner and I said, "Your architects and engineers and your builder are wrong. You don't have to take this down. We can figure this out." And he said, "Well, how are we going to do it?" And I said, "The historic tax credit program." And he said, "Do you know much about it?" And I said, "Not really." But I called Randy Alexander, and he sent over one of their developers who's still there today, who introduced me to Jonathan by the name of David Voss. And so that was really the start of our career. We were able to put together a tax credit project, and they hired us as the construction manager, and kind of the rest was history. But I wanted to just share that a little bit. We live in kind of a small world, and I'm on the phone to this day monthly with Jonathan and David, and they've been strong mentors of our company. So I wanted to just, before we talk about Sinsinawa, I wanted to just share, and this all came together here really in the last week with Jonathan and Matt and the students coming down to Sinsinawa. But when I learned about the programming, I thought I would share this. This is the St. Mary's Church campus, and it's our most iconic church campus in the city of Dubuque. This is one of the highest steeples in the Midwest, and this came very close to demolition a few years back. We were asked to sit on a committee to help the Archdiocese divest themselves of this piece of real estate, and all the offers that came in were for demolition, and someone was going to put a cheap apartment building on the site. They wanted the beautiful stained glass windows. They wanted the brick. So we suggested to them in one meeting in an afternoon, we said, well, if you're unhappy with the result and you think something is going to change, you're kidding yourself. Nobody from the private sector is going to come up and buy this thing. At that time, the steeple was leaning a little bit. The numbers were scary to a number of people. They didn't know whether it was $500,000 to restore it or $3 million. There was different estimates. So we decided one afternoon that we suggested that the community needed to embrace this, start a nonprofit, and take care of this project. And I had someone say to me, you know, if you pull this off, this will speak volumes of what your community thinks of itself. And if you let it go down, it will also speak volumes of what the community thinks of itself. This has been a beacon in our community since the 1860s, and it's in the heart of our most vulnerable neighborhood. And that was part of the other reason too, is what are we saying to those folks living in the neighborhood? You know, where we're making investments throughout our community, but we would let this potentially go down. So we started a nonprofit the very next morning after that meeting that I talked to you about, and we did an envisioning process. We defined the scope of work. We built a budget. We engaged historic consultants. Bill was on that team. We brought an architect to the table that we work with quite a bit, and we built a board from nothing of community leaders. And we had a donor who showed up who said, I'll give you $600,000 based on your vision to help you with the design, the engineering, the tax credit consulting process. And we thought the project was going to be 11 million, but as we got into the design and engineering, it grew to 14 million. But the vision for the site was to reuse the church as a community center, the school, which had been boarded up since 1980. We converted that to transitional apartments. And then the rectory, we restored the building, and it's now a daycare. The area was starved for and in huge need of a daycare. We hired a landscape architect and did a revisioned the site. It was basically a lot of asphalt. It's a beautiful site to this day. The steeple was, a really interesting project, but the scaffolding goes up 220 feet in the air, and you can see the picture of the completed project over to the right. But it's a vibrant, beautiful site, and it was a great kind of community building project that brought a lot of people together. Mm-hmm. And that was a mix of historic tax credit, state, federal. We got a new market tax credit allocation. We got a lead challenge grant from the Jeffress Foundation from here in Wisconsin, and they played a huge role in this. So go ahead. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this was a project in our millwork district in Dubuque. This building also was close to the wrecking ball because it had the roof had leaked for a number of years. And we did some engagement with a credit union where they were on the lookout for a operational center, and they approached us and they said, we want you to take us through the planning process. We're going to hire you under one condition. Our board is concerned that you're going to talk us into a historic building, and we don't want anything to do with a historic building. We've heard too many horror stories about people controlling costs. So we said, well, we'll agree to that, but can we at least look at it? And after a 3-year process of designing new buildings, we almost bought a building that was built in the 90s and converted it. And it went back to this. And this is actually gave them all of their programming needs, and it saved them close to $20 million. Mm-hmm. And they did a magnificent job. Mm-hmm. And so we've done a number of religious projects, church campuses, and this is the Archdiocese main campus in Dubuque. Yep. And then this was a little church that also was almost lost to deconstruction. And this started with a donor wanting to put the bell tower back on mm-hmm. the building. And so they wanted to contribute $200,000 to do that. And when we got into the process, we said the building needs to be completely restored. So they donated the rest of the money for it, and we did a tax credit project and completely restored the building back to the way it was originally.
Yeah. Excellent starter.
And then this is another downtown project that was done for the same family that allowed us to restore the town clock building, our first tax credit project that the Alexander Company helped us with. A few years later, we did this building across the street. And I point that out because of just the catalytic. If we hadn't found a way to restore the building 20 years earlier, I don't think that they would have been inspired to completely reconstruct this magnificent property. All of the terracotta and cast iron, the bronze doors, during urban renewal, it was all taken out and all of it was reconstructed. So during this journey, my wife and I and a group of people started a nonprofit in our community called Heritage Works, because we saw so many projects that were smaller in nature but really important that didn't have the expertise. They had the will and the passion but not the expertise to execute on their tax credit programs. So the family that we did the town clock building with and ourselves founded a nonprofit called Heritage Works. that's run by a very capable group of people that do consulting, mainly in Dubuque, but throughout our state in historic preservation projects. And a couple of years ago, we were approached by the Dominican Sinsinawa they were deep into a master plan to, because of their aging population, moving a number of their sisters close to Milwaukee to a new retirement center. And their plan, the committee that was put together that came from outside of the community, their vision was to take the rotunda down and the building up on the right. And they've come and they've still may head in that direction, but they were overwhelmed with the project. They had the wrong consultants at the table who came in with the idea that the simple answer is to take this down. So I'm going to let Bill kind of take this over from here, but a while back we called Jonathan and we said, hey, we are so busy right now in a number of projects, and we've been reapproached by some members of their community that were not part of the bureaucratic decision-making process that's led them to the decision of taking this down. They've grabbed the bull by the horns and said, we got to do something different. And they've opened the door for ideas. And so this has all come together extremely quickly, where we are trying to pull, some good thought leaders together to talk about what could be done with saving, the important parts of this building. And I'm going to have Bill give you a little history here. And Jonathan, I don't know if you want to come down at any point too and talk about this too, from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so basically how this came to Dwayne, my boss at Heritage Works, was the idea of demolishing this mid-century building, including this beautiful round rotunda with just beautiful artwork in. It's kind of this mid-century style that a lot of people don't appreciate yet or view as historic yet. But Dwayne kind of ended up engaging with a few of the sisters early on, and it was actually from that Steeple Square project that John mentioned early on, where he met some of the Dominican sisters because they were involved in trying to save the St. Mary's or Steeple Square project, and basically alerted us to this idea that they have this shrinking kind of congregation of nuns, and that they're all probably going to move off site. So they had kind of engaged with this landscape architecture firm, which had essentially planted this idea of demolishing these mid-century buildings, even though they're massive concrete things and would need to be blasted out of there and removed at considerable expense with the use of considerable amounts of energy. But their kind of pitch deck for removing the buildings was that the Dominican sisters had scarred the beautiful natural landscape in building the building. And so there's basically two factions of sisters, one which thought that they might have something worthwhile to pass on, and some that I think probably, in honesty, just wanted to be rid of the problems. They didn't have to think about it, which is understandable. But a little bit of background on the site. So here's a map. It's about a 12-minute drive from Dubuque, Iowa. So this is right on the border with Illinois and Iowa. You can see we did a whole national district nomination for this, and just trying to save it. Dwayne spent hours and hours talking to these sisters, many decision makers in the room, and all getting their voices heard, their answers or their questions answered, sometimes the same question answered multiple times. So it was a little bit of a frustrating project, but there were also some sisters who really were passionate about the site and were passionate about finding a new use for it. You can see it's a really big site, mostly including this natural area with a mound and hiking trails, and just kind of something that could be a beautiful amenity for future use. So you can see kind of our contributing resource map here. This is one of the more unusual historic districts I've worked on. We had so many sites, structures, and objects. I feel like usually I'm just all buildings with historic districts. But the site really spans from the 1830s. So this old fort / grain storage building was built in 1832. So almost, really early building for western Wisconsin, kind of out in the middle of nowhere. This was built by somebody who had opened a lead mine and used this building either as a fort, as the research is sort of unclear on, or to store grain. But then we kind of get to this school use. So there's a man named Father Samuel Kelly, who was kind of a pioneer missionary who founded a school here. First it started off as a men's school, and the men's school never really took root. Actually, the Civil War kind of ended up killing the men's school. But the Dominicans had lived in these surrounding communities and had girls' schools in the surrounding communities beginning in the 1850s. And this was also during a time where the Dominican order became really interested in expanding what they did. They didn't want to just be cloistered nuns who prayed. They wanted to get involved in education, in teaching. So this became a high school for girls. And between Father Kelly and some of the founding Dominican sisters, they picked this completely new direction. And they really had their own agency in the decisions they made, separate from the Catholic Church. And it becomes this, as we're researching this building, we're surprised at how much of a women's education story and women's significant site that it really was. So school becomes used for women's education, becomes a high school, like a local high school, and they're not learning all domestic things like sewing and playing piano, and it wasn't a finishing school. They were learning classical education, same education that men would have got at the time. So it's pretty interesting from that regard. They did build a convent building for a lot of the sisters to stay at, and the academy building on which most of the classes were held. So there's also this huge kind of push for this religious revival in the mid-century. So they build this huge complex, and right after they finish it, just a steady decline and new people interested in pursuing religious orders at that time. So they have this incredible mid-century building, and we've got the kind of LiDAR scans of that, so we'll be able to take a look at that more in the future. But it really kind of articulated well with the historic buildings of the campus, and also expressed these mid-century ideas, and the site's full of these mosaics and beautiful stained glass windows and things that were related to part of the sisters' interest in the arts and studying of the arts. So it's this really kind of important continuation of the founding of this mission of education and arts focus, and this endpoint in the mid-century, how that evolved over time. So it'd be really nice to see it retained, obviously. So you can see some of the mosaics on the site, and these are all designed by specific sisters and who just basically live their lives practicing art. And I know we don't have a ton of time, so I kind of try to speed through that. Here's a rendering of the mid-century building that is currently threatened, and I think this is a great time to see some of our photogrammetry images of the site.
Do you have any pictures of the inside of that?
I figured they come down with the with the LiDAR, yeah. So one thing you will see as they come down here is this rotunda building. It has this beautiful stained glass kind of clerestory, and it was designed by this nun named Sister Teresita. But it kind of follows seasons and also these religious themes, but it's also beautifully abstract and really remarkable to behold. Probably one of our best examples of mid-century architecture near our part of the country. So.
Hi, so we've kind of already talked about this project, but we're going to go a little bit into the documentation of the project. So, like we've already covered, the Dominican Motherhouse at Sinsinawa Mound, and this is just demonstrating the rapid applications of laser scanning and photogrammetry in its entirety. And so we scanned this on Wednesday, and then William did an interior scan of the rotunda on last Wednesday, maybe, but we'll just continue to go through that.
So for William's scan, he scanned with the Faro 360 scanner, and it took him about 2.5 hours. It also took about 2 hours of processing time. And then for the drone on Wednesday, it took us about ½ an hour, which was perfect because the sun was going down. And then computer processing time was about 8 hours.
So the Faro scan, these are just photos of the interior, just to demonstrate the size, I guess. And then that scan itself, like we said, is 2.5 hours of scanning. We produced 8 scans, and then I processed it in about 2 hours. And on the right, that's the point cloud. So the process of it, we kind of went into depth yesterday about the realigning process and the registering, but this is pretty much what it looks like in the aligning process. We use spheres and checkerboards and some extra points just to further align it so everything is accurate. And then this is an overview map in the works to show the 2 scans aligning and making sure that everything is perfect as much as we can. And then the overview map really just demonstrates on how accurate the model is itself, and this was just with 8 scans in like 2.5 hours. So it's just kind of proving how quick everything can turn around. On the left is a photo of the interior, and then on the right is a point cloud. Just to show how accurate our scanning is, and a couple extra photos just to demonstrate the same thing. So from here we can measure and we can tell accurate data points and begin to accurately model this comprehensively.
For the drone scanning, like we said, it took about half an hour to scan. Here's an example of the flight path after we put it into our processing software. So through that 34 minutes of filming, we got about 2,099 photos. And you can see here on the right, that is the flight path of the drone. So all of those kind of little white dots, those are the images that were pulled from the video. This particular scan, we did about 3 different flight paths. So we did a grid pattern to start with, kind of back and forth over the building. And then we flew the drone out and kind of orbited around the building to get the entire building in view. And then we did one more flight path orbiting around closer up to capture more detail. And with the way photogrammetry works, you kind of have to have overlap between the photos so that it can register a point. Here's just another image of that point cloud after we calculated it. And here's an image after we colorized it. And again, you can see those white dots. So that was the flight path of the drone. And those are all the individual images. And this is just kind of a video of that constructed 3D model after the scan.
From there, we were able to pull some orthographic views. So we have like the front of the rotunda and obviously all the other directions, and then slight obstructions with the trees. But it was a quick opportunity that we had, and then we had the rotunda plan as well, just showing the full point cloud on the left, and then just the rotunda on the right that is more like articulate. And then we were also able to put together a virtual 360 interior tour if you wanted to see the interior of the space. If you were here yesterday, we talked about this a lot with Gabby Bustos, so feel free to check that out. But yeah, that's what we did in the matter of 8 hours.
Yeah.
I think it took longer for me to put together the presentation.